arrived in this country first and in what order. There are two ways of looking at it. One is you consult the pollen record, which tells you definitively which trees came when. But the other way to do it is to start at the far north of Scotland and travel south and write down or observe what trees you encounter on the way. That's pretty much the order in which they arrive in Britain. Anyway, I think Jonathan's going to do something clever, and we're going to have a small poll that you can complete. So we're going to ask you which was the first tree species to colonize Britain after the last ice age. And if you click on one of those, then we'll have a poll and we'll see what everybody thinks is our first tree.
So there is a sixth option there, which is willow. So you may have to scroll in that to see that.
Oh yeah, right at the bottom. Aspen, birch, hazel, oak, Scots pine, willow. And of course, one of the ways of thinking about this is to ask yourself how the first trees arrived after the last ice age. And I suppose we take it for granted that trees grow from seed, but trees reproduction is quite a complex business. And of course, trees can't arrive without there being a means for them to arrive. So that's a bit of a clue to possibly parts of that order. Are we getting votes in, Jonathan?
Yeah, so I've had 8 responses so far. Just waiting for a few more. I've got one more person arriving now.
Oh, I suppose I should vote, shouldn't I? I mean, it's cheating slightly because I'm going to reveal the answer in a minute.
So I'll just read the results we have so far. So most people have voted for birch. That's 50% of our crowd today. And next comes Scots pine, and there's been votes for hazel, oak, and willow as well. Okay,
well, that's just a little. So we got Dorothy waiting, Jonathan, if you'll let her in.
Yes.
For those who don't know Dorothy is a botanist of repute in these parts and knows all about woodland flora. Okay, so the reveal is this. So about 11,000 BC, our very first trees arrive. And the key thing about the succession of trees arriving is that each tree needs to be distributed by a partner. And in the case of the first 2 trees, birch and aspen, they're both pollinated by wind and their seed is dispersed by wind. And if you think about it, if there are no insects or birds or humans in Britain before there are trees, it's quite difficult for something like an oak to arrive, which is heavily dependent on a single bird, the jay. If there are no jays, there are no oak trees. Almost all the oak trees, apart from the ones planted by humans, are propagated by jays burying them. And jays are somewhat forgetful about where they plant acorns. Hazel, as most of you know, are hazelnuts are buried by squirrels, and they don't remember where all their nuts are either. But most of the first trees essentially are pollinated by the wind and either dispersed by the wind or through other slightly more nefarious means. So the willow, for example, a branch will break off a willow, and if it lands in mud, there's a fair chance of it striking, is the term, which means it'll just grow from a stick, and it's a very easy way to propagate willow, just by cutting one off last year's growth and sticking it in the ground. That tells us something about the natural ecologies of trees in this country. But I want to talk now really about the history of human beings and trees in this country. There are essentially no wildwoods left in Britain. People sometimes talk about the Caledonian forest in Scotland as if it's wild, and it certainly has some natural aspects to it, but essentially pretty much all the woodland and forest in Britain has been managed at one point or another by humans. We'll talk a little bit about that now. This what I call the wood age is the age during which wood was essentially the primary technological material for human beings. And I don't know if any of you recognize the guy in this picture. This is a guy called Ben Law, who was very famous 20 years ago on Grand Designs when he built this woodland house, which I'm glad to say is still standing with Ben sitting in front of it and a very impressive wood pile behind him. Well, I might talk about Ben a little bit more later on, but he's a well-known woodsman. Well, going back to the earliest part of the wood age, I suppose we would look at what archaeologists call the Mesolithic, or the Middle Stone Age. So essentially, this is people arriving in Britain after the end of the Ice Age and arriving in a land which is still joined to Europe, of course, by Doggerland. There's a land bridge, and we have some pretty good evidence now of the people who foraged and hunted and fished and gathered in Britain during the Mesolithic period, from sites like Starcar in East Yorkshire, Howick on the Northumberland coast, and various other places. Essentially, Mesolithic foragers are subsisting off game, shellfish, plants they gather, roots, sort of hunter-gatherer lifestyle that you still see around the world, but very much marginalized now. And the sort of woodland ecology of these people is they have stone axes. They don't have any metal. They're absolutely expert at using sticks that they can break off and cut. They know how to take planks off trees. Essentially what they do is they chop a bit out of a tree and then they lever up a plank out of a tree. The tree survives. And they can keep harvesting trees in a rather sustainable way. They tend to be transhumantic. They tend to move around the landscape seasonally, following game, perhaps returning to a home base, often living on lakesides. And their environment is highly wooded, not continuously wooded, but highly wooded. And they manipulate their environment so that they attract game to clearings, and they understand about fishing. They're expert fishers, and one of their favorite foods is hazelnuts. And in fact, it's often thought that Mesolithic foragers may be responsible for the arrival of hazel in this country, because wherever you find a Mesolithic camp, you find cracked hazelnut shells in the fireplace, which is rather handy for archaeologists because we can carbon date them. So our Mesolithic settlements are really quite well dated. Traditionally, the Neolithic, the New Stone Age, begins in Britain around somewhere between 4,000 and 3,500 BC. And Neolithic farmers are much more adept and ambitious at manipulating their environment. This picture here shows the sweet track, a reconstruction of the sweet track across the marshes near Glastonbury in Somerset. And this is a highly engineered structure in which they drive poles into the bog, essentially in an X shape, and with a rail beneath them which stabilizes them, ties them together, and they put a plank boarding on top which they mortise into the X frame. And the people who studied this landscape are pretty sure that they built this mile-long causeway in a single day. In other words, it was pre-prepared. It was assembled from a kit that they cut in the woods. So these people are absolutely expert woodworkers. They build themselves houses made of wood. They understand wood technology. They know how to split it. They know how to season it. And they're beginning to manipulate their environment. And one of the things they will have realized is that when you cut a tree down, most broadleaf species, So oak, willow, hazel, beech, for example, probably not much beech around at that time, will grow again from the stump. In other words, they know what coppicing is. And that means they can harvest wood of a particular size on a regular basis. So the sweet track, for example, was built of poles which were cut from trees which were something like 8 to 15 years old through their coppice cycle. So they're regularly harvesting wood of the same bore and size. So effectively, they are farming forests. Obviously, they're also cultivating grain, but they're manipulating their environment in a much more proactive way than the Mesolithic foragers, and they're clearing fields. And by the Bronze Age, which is sort of 1600 BC onwards, there is widespread clearance of woodland, such that ecologists now think that most of the tree cover in the British Isles was gone by the end of the Bronze Age. So the tree cover is not much different from what it is now by the end of the prehistoric period, which comes as quite a surprise to people who think that it was the Royal Navy who cut down all our trees. It's a bit of a myth. So your medieval woodlander, at a period I sort of call peak wood, when wood is so central to people's lives that people use wood almost as a metaphor for understanding and framing their lives. Alfred the Great, for example, writes an extraordinary piece of metaphor about going into the woods and hewing with his axe and building an edifice and hoping that all like-minded people will do the same thing. What he's actually talking about is culture and civilization and learned people. But he's using wood as a metaphor, knowing that all his people will understand the metaphor perfectly. If you look at the Bayeux Tapestry of the 11th century, you can see how much wood is central to people's lives in shipbuilding, in fashioning houses. Sorry, there's a noise going off somewhere. I don't know what it is. It's finished. So the medieval woodlander is really deeply embedded in woodcraft, for wheelwrights, for making pretty much everything in the home. And then we reach the end of the Wood Age, which I myself date to about 1779, when the iron bridge was built across the Severn Gorge at Coalbrookdale. It's a bit of an arbitrary date, but essentially after that point, wood is no longer the primary technological material, and we move into an iron age, a new iron age, if you like, or an oil age or a steam age. And so in the 19th century, essentially woodworking becomes a specialist craft. And although much of people's lives is still constructed from wood, it's no longer the primary technological driver for the human endeavor. And now we are at a period past the Wood Age in which wood is commodified, if you like. Not many people are woodsmen or woodswomen anymore. Wood arrives on pallets, or it arrives on shelves, or it arrives in IKEA branches. And most people's lives are detached from understanding the link between habitat, woodland, woodcraft, and the product. However, I think we've got another little test, haven't we, Jonathan, which we want to do. I did an exercise years ago with some children on surnames. Surnames, of course, are very instructive, because one of the ways in which surnames form is from people's occupations. And we jotted down a hand list of the occupations that give us some of our English surnames, which are based on woodcraft. So I think, Jonathan, are we going to do a sort of chat poll here?
Yes, that's right. So I just put a question in the chat which says, many of our ancestors took their family name from the work they did with trees. How many woody surnames can you think of? So just keep them coming in the chat.
Yeah, I've jotted down 14. Remarkable number of them seem to have been comedians or actors.
Yes, nice.
I actually have a friend who lives in the northeast whose name, there's a word, isn't there, for people whose names are what they do still? What's the word? Anyway, his name's Dennis Turner, and he is a Turner, which is highly gratifying. So have we got any? Oaks, yeah, Oaks, Woodman,
Turner, yes.
Turner, yeah.
Wood, Sawyer.
Sawyer, very good. Oakley. Yes, Oakley may be one of those ones that's actually named after a place, because Oakley is a place, which would be a clearing in an oak wood.
Mm-hmm. Sayer, I suppose that could be a sort of contraction of Sawyer.
Could be, yeah. Still a few.
Yeah.
Think about people who make things. What would somebody who makes a chest be called?
Carpenter.
Well, of course, Carpenter is a good English surname, but Wainwright, very good. Someone who makes wheels, or rather wagons. Actually, we've got a few. There are a few right names, people who make things. So there's Wainwright, who makes wagons.
Forester.
Yes, you can have Forester. You could have Cartwright for someone who makes. Cooper, we've now got, very good. Smith, really, of course, an iron worker.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've got Wainwright, you can have Cartwright. You can have, I don't know the surname Wheelwright. I don't think I've ever heard anyone called Wheelwright, but it ought to be just as common as Fletcher, of course, is to do with feathers. It's about attaching feathers to an arrow.
Yeah. Wow.
I don't, unless a Fletcher is someone who makes the arrows as well. Maybe. How many have we got?
Got some great suggestions coming through. Cooper's another one, Matt.
Yeah, Cooper's a good one, a barrel maker. Well, there's a couple more I've jotted down. Someone who makes chests is an arkwright.
Oh.
And I suppose it's slightly, am I right in thinking that Ron E. Barker played an arkwright and is therefore a double Woody surname? And there's one you might not get. If you, Bowyer. A bowyer would use yew, although oddly enough, English yew, although it does make good bows, was not often used for bow making. Normally they use Spanish yews. Yew is a particularly brilliant wood for making bows, because the bow is cut from the junction between the hard, dark heartwood and the lighter, bendier sapwood. So you get maximum tensile strength from the hardwood, and you get the flexibility of the sapwood. And all yew bows are fashioned in that manner, and there's no other wood really that will do that. Well, there's one more that I was kind of hoping nobody would get, because I could feel smug. If you go to your kitchen cabinet and look at your cereal, you may find that some cereal is made by a particularly famous American brand who make cornflakes. And a Kellogg is someone who drives pigs into the woods in autumn to eat oak and beech nuts. So
Wow.
it's the keeper of the hogs, the hog keeper. So there you go. That's a pub quiz job for somebody who wants to. So so we once had much woodier lives, but not so long ago somebody asked me to write a piece for a magazine, and I was trying to reconnect people with wood, and I thought, actually, although we might think our lives are more distant from wood, I think people have a surprisingly strong connection with wood that they sometimes don't think about. And we were going to We were going to ask a question about that, Jonathan, I think.
Yeah, we were. So we're 25 minutes in, so we'll do a couple of these. So I guess our first question is, from where you're sitting at the moment, how many of you can see trees from where you're sitting?
Yeah.
So maybe we could do this with a show of hands. You can either raise your hand in your window, or you can raise your hand virtually.
So how do you raise your hand virtually, Jonathan?
So next to the chat icon, you should see this sort of.
Oh, at the top, so you can do a sort of thumbs up type thing. Okay. Yeah. Well, I can see it.
So
I'm actually quite lucky because I can see a hornbeam, and I bet not many people can see a hornbeam from their windows.
Oh yes, we can.
Somebody else has got a hornbeam. Excellent. Very good. Who's that?
Hornbeam.
I think you can hear us, but not see us.
You can hear me.
Oh, is that David Cowan's in the back?
Yes, it is.
Quite a long way away.
So thank you for that. So you can put your hands down because I'm going to ask another question. So how many of you from where you're sitting now can reach out and touch something that's made from wood?
Yes.
I know I can, so I'm going to put my hand up here.
We have to, I suppose, consider whether chipboard counts or MDF. Woody products, but not necessarily wood.
And okay, thank you for that. That's about the same number, six.
Oh yeah. So Mark is saying that he can see at Heavenfield Oak, which is rather nice because Heavenfield is the place where King Oswald raised his wooden cross to signal his intent to win victory in Northumbria against the pagans as a Christian king. And of course, the irony don't get me started on King Oswald. Oh, you have. The irony of King Oswald, of course, is that when he was killed, he was cut to pieces and his bits were stuck up on poles at a place that became known as Oswald's Tree in sort of rather grisly irony, or Oswestry. So, and of course, the idea of crucifixion and trees is very central to all sorts of religious mythologies.
So let's have one more question, Max. So I'm going to go with, did you have any wood products for your breakfast this morning? And again, please sort of show your hand if you think you have. Okay, well, maybe it's more of you than you think. So, for example, coffee. Who had coffee? That's from a tree. Who had orange juice? Oranges from a tree.
Spaghetti doesn't count. Doesn't grow on trees, despite common belief.
That was the golden age of April Fool's jokes on TV.
It was.
And maybe you cut your bread on a wooden breadboard. Yeah.
I mean, coffee's a rather interesting one. We rather take coffee for granted that we can get hold of it. And some of you, or most of you, will know that we only commercially use two subspecies of coffee. One is Coffea. Is it Robusta? Coffea Robusta and Coffea Arabica. And the interesting thing about that is because all tree species that grow even as cultivars commercially are pretty seriously threatened by climate change and disease. And coffee production is incredibly reliant on these two species, just as banana production is heavily reliant, I think, on one species. And the crazy thing is that there are 124 species of wild coffee, some of which produces naturally decaffeinated beans. Some coffee beans don't have caffeine in them. So of all the 60,000 trees in the world, the huge diversity of tree species we have, very like our staple crops, like our cereals, we actually use very few of our tree species. And although that may be good in one sense, it means that some of those are very vulnerable to the sorts of changes that are going on in the world: drought, flood, and disease, and so on. We, of course, in Britain have suffered two catastrophic tree losses in the last 50 years. First, elm decline, and now Shalara fraxinea, which is killing off all our ash trees. And we're also suffering from acute oak decline. So we probably have you got that, Jonathan?
Yes,
yeah.
Right.
Okay, so although we no longer live in a wood age, we're still pretty tied to wood as a commodity, even though we are alienated, I suppose, many of us, from understanding really the ecology of trees, woodlands, and woodlanders. So I suppose we come to the key question for Woods for the Trees: why do we need more trees? There's huge debate at the moment with lots of people saying, whatever you do, don't plant trees. Trees are a terrible thing to plant. They ruin our peatlands. Rewilding is the way to go. We've got enough trees. Planted trees are no good. You hear all sorts of things, which I suppose I can distill down into a few key arguments. One is that planting trees in the wrong place can be as catastrophically bad as planting them in the right place is good. We now know that we shouldn't be planting trees on our peatlands because, oddly enough, peat absorbs more carbon dioxide and traps it more efficiently than trees do. But everybody knows, I think, that tree cover in the world globally needs to dramatically increase. We also know that forests and woodlands around the world are under severe pressure. The British government is pledged to plant, I can't remember what the current figure is, but it's gazillions of trees. And we have to think, first of all, where are we going to put all those trees? If our farmland is producing food, our peatlands are storing carbon, where are we going to put all these trees? And it's a pretty seriously important question, I think. You know, one thing's for sure, Britain has considerably below the European average tree cover. If you look at it's great fun to you know, go on Google Earth or Bing Maps or something and look at the rest of the world's tree cover. You know, France, Spain, Italy, Romania, Czechoslovakia all got vastly more trees than we have in their landscape. Ireland, of course, has very small tree cover. So the question is, where can we as an island put more trees? And it's a tricky question. And as we consider that, we have to think about the fact that, for example, Britain is the 5th largest importer of timber globally. So we import very, very large numbers of trees as timber. We quite often import them from places where trees probably shouldn't be cut down. Most of our trees are most of our timber is probably imported from Scandinavia, as it has been for 400-500 years. Sweden, Norway have always been our great tree suppliers. But we also, for example, import something like 65,000 tons of charcoal for the benefit of our outdoor cooking passion. And a lot of that charcoal comes from mangrove forests that are being cut down for prawn fishing. And the tsunami of 2005, of course, taught us that the ecology of the mangrove, which the whole ecology is called the mangal, of which the mangrove is the keystone species, is absolutely crucial to coastal defences. And those areas that had surviving mangal forests on their shores had much less of a hit from the tsunami than those that where the mangrove had been denuded. If we take it that we do need more trees and we have to plant them in places that aren't prime agricultural lands, there's quite a lot of land that isn't productive in Britain. Should we plant trees in all unproductive bits? Should we turn over sheep pasture to trees? I would have to say yes to that because I'm about to do it, but none of these, you know, planting trees even I think is a good thing to do, but it doesn't come with no implications. it's worth posing the question, because we get asked by quite a lot of people, if I wanted to make a difference and plant a small wood, if I wanted to persuade my council to let me plant up a verge or a plot of land, how many trees makes a woodland? There's an interesting movement going on at the moment called microforests, and they're looking at woods which occupy something like the size of a tennis court. And you think, well, that's not very many trees, but actually you can have a very rich tree-based ecology in a remarkably small area. I don't know what a tennis court is. It's, I don't know, an eighth or a tenth of an acre or something. It's tiny. And of course, you can have huge, great schemes, thousands of hectares. And in Scotland, particularly in the borders and in the far northwest, some really very big tree planting schemes are happening. But I suppose the answer to how many trees make a woodland is actually a bit of a trick question. Because if you take a woodland that's been there for a long time, say 100 years, and you cut all the trees down, in the process upsetting all sorts of people and having protesters and people being heavily exercised in the media, the answer is actually you don't need any trees in a woodland, because what really counts is the soil. And Dorothy is as someone who understands ancient woodland botany, we've had many discussions, Dorothy and I, about soils and actually what's going on underground and how long it takes to grow a woodland soil. Nobody really knows. And at some point, we're going to have to do the research to find out how long this happens. But essentially, there is no minimum number of trees to make a woodland. A woodland happens when there are trees in a place long enough to create a soil which is a woodland soil, which is high in carbon, high in phosphorus, high in invertebrates that eat dead wood, high in leaf mold, and high in these extraordinary things which we've only known about for the last decade or so, called mycorrhizal fungi, which are filaments that are in the soil anyway, but they link the root networks of trees, particularly things like Scots pine and beech. But these trees are effectively linked up by an underground network. And what basically happens is that the surface area of a tree's roots are effectively expanded exponentially by these mycorrhizal fungi, which harvest nitrogen from poor soils and feed them into the tree, and the tree in return gives them sugar. It's one of those extraordinary natural bits of symbiosis that prove just how miraculous trees are. So really, there's no piece of land too small that can't have a woodland or a forest on it. And as soon as you plant trees, you do remarkable things. Of course, you tie water up in the soil. You begin to foster this underground network of well, it's a whole different biozone underneath the soil. Obviously, you increase the temperature of the air immediately above the ground, and you cool it in summer and warm it in winter. So trees are like hairy arms. They provide an insulating layer, and of course trees are giving off oxygen and absorbing carbon dioxide, stuff we know about. And also, if we're the fifth largest importer of trees and we import so much charcoal, potentially with all the new tree planting, we could be producing much more of our own timber and underwood, all sorts of other products from wood. So there are many benefits. But there are tree planting schemes and there are tree planting schemes. And I don't know what you think about this. I haven't counted the trees. It's obviously a quite big tree planting scheme. And the caption at the bottom says, "What's missing from this image?" Well, I hope we can get to that in a minute. One of the things I did when I was preparing slides for this is ask, what does a tree need to be happy? Does it need to be with other trees? And there are trees fall into two sort of happy, unhappy categories. One is the gregarious tree, trees that like to be with others of their own kind. We often see things like an oak tree standing in a field, but actually oak trees are happier, and I don't mean happy in the anthropomorphic sense. I just mean they are more successful surrounded by other oak trees. if you go into a wood with oaks in it, chances are that most of the trees are oak trees. In an ash wood, most of the trees are ash. Although you do get common mixtures of trees, ash and hazel, oak and holly, and oak and beech, for example. So you do get mixes, but essentially the trees that produce the trees like oaks and beech and Scots pine, especially the ones that are connected by mycorrhizal fungi. And in the case of the oak, oaks communicate with each other through releasing vaporized tannins. Tannin is a poison, but it's also a chemical message. And when an oak leaves breathe in tannin vapor from another oak tree, it tells them that there's an insect attack going on. And all the oak trees that breathe this in suddenly start producing more tannin as a defense mechanism. They're not talking to each other. They're not sentient creatures, but they are communicating. So oaks are gregarious. Whereas some trees, for example, the trees with the fleshy fruits, like rowan, like whitebeam, for example, like cherries, are essentially non-gregarious. In the wild, you wouldn't find them together, and they are reproductively adapted to having a bird come and eat their seeds, stripping away the seed dormancy as they do in the acid of their stomach, and then pooing them out somewhere else with a convenient fertilizer, but not near the parent tree. So there are gregarious trees and non-gregarious trees. So you wouldn't plant a wood of rowan. It would look stunning, but that's a very artificial ecology. Anyway, thinking of happy trees, well, there was only one other thing I could think of. It made me think of the great Bob Ross, whose attitude was, let's just have another tree here. We got some very happy trees, and you can't have too many trees. So the Bob Ross view is that you can't have too many trees. And actually, I think that's something we could challenge, because if we go back to that slide, these trees are spaced 1.5 meters, 2 meters apart. Can you have too many trees? And maybe the answer is yeah, potentially. Anyway, for Bob Ross, you can't have too many trees. They're always happy. The more the merrier. Yeah. Are trees happy when they are cut down? Well, trees don't much care whether they're cut down or not. As I say, broadleaves respond, generally speaking, to being cut down by growing again. And in fact, the longest lived trees you will find in the British landscape are trees that have been cut down on a regular basis over thousands of years. A coppiced tree can survive much longer than an uncoppiced tree. In that particular picture, of course, what we see is harvested is a commercial conifer plantation. And although people don't much like to admit it, I know, because I've spoken to people in the Forestry Commission, the Kielder Forest, for example, is now in some places in its third crop cycle of conifers, and they're not doing well. There's only so much you can take out of the soil. And of course, beneath those conifers, there's nothing happening on the ground. It's heavily acidified, covered in needles. There's no light. There are no flowers. And we have to think about how we mix our desire for conifer production, which supports our timber industry, and ecologies that are sustainable over the long period. So a conifer plantation is being, well, it should be thinned every 5 or 10 years to its final crop at 50, 60, 70 years. So that's a cycle of perhaps 70 years. And you go through 3 of those cycles and you've got a piece of dead land. And of course, what's left behind is something that's fit for nothing else, because you can't plant anything here because it's full of tree stumps. So those may not be very happy trees. And we actually have the same problem in ancient woodlands, which are not managed, because all our ancient woodlands have survived because they are managed very actively by people taking regular produce out of them, either as coppice wood or as standards every 80, 90, 100 years. And one of the most important things to think about managed woodland is the fact that it produces stuff. in the bottom left-hand corner here, we have Ben Law's house, which was constructed almost entirely from sweet chestnut, which is a wonderfully durable construction timber, grows like stink in the south of England, brought by the Romans. The legionaries couldn't do without their polenta. Ben's wood is called prickly nut wood, appropriately, which you would understand if you walk through there in autumn, because you get bombarded with chestnuts, which of course are edible. I suppose our contention at Woods for the Trees is that the happiest trees are the trees that live in partnership with people. The most ecologically rich woodland habitats are where people manage them on cycles that produce varied habitats of light, shade, edge, and are producing wood and other products. The Woodland Trust has just produced a survey of the health of English woodlands, and it doesn't make very good reading. Most English woodlands are in habitat decline. They're ecologically not healthy. And part of that, at least, is because they are not being managed. And so it's ironic that a productive woodland that's having stuff taken out of it in the right way, sustainably, can sustain over thousands of years as an ecologically rich, productive habitat. Whereas wood that's planted for a single crop doesn't tend to do so well, and wood that's left alone, ancient woodland that's not managed, goes into ecological decline, because you just get a canopy of trees all the same age. And unless you have a huge area of that, like half the size of Poland, that doesn't have enough room to go through all the cycles it needs to keep as a healthy wood. So I don't know whether people want to 5 trees per square meter trialing on land. So Mark says 5 trees per square meter trialing on land in North Cumbria. Crikey. Yeah, 30,000 hectares a year for 3 years as the government's. What does everyone think about this image of a plantation? Anyone think what's wrong with this, if they think there's anything wrong with it? I know Mark will have an opinion on that.
So please share if you've got an idea. Just to a time check for you, we've got 10 minutes, just over 10 minutes left.
Okay, so very quickly, yeah, no, Millie says no biodiversity. Yeah, there's nothing visible. There aren't any people. Stuart, yeah, it needs rides. Yeah, there's no access in there. So after about 5 years, you wouldn't be able to get anywhere in there to manage it. So clearly that's not designed ever to be managed. It's just trees. It's not going to be a managed woodland. It couldn't be a managed woodland. Yeah, no people, no open spaces, no water features. Yeah, it needs space. It needs the most productive ecological woodlands are woodlands where there is an edge, where you have a range of plants going from the ground up to the canopy with bushy layers. Those are the places where the butterflies and the insects thrive. Anyway, as Jonathan says, we need to move on. But I think you get the point. So, you know, Woods for the Trees was set up with all this in mind, and thinking about not just about planting trees, but actually about planting people in woodlands. And I've, I suppose, coined the term social ecologies, which is an ecology where you have trees and people in the landscape. You're building woodland soils. Okay, it's gonna, you know, any woodland soil that I try and generate won't come to fruition until after I'm gone. But we know that in time a woodland flora will come in with all those wonderful. Dorothy will tell us how many standard woodland species there are in a wood in Northumberland. It's in the 40s in terms of flowers. People working in woods, people working with wood, people understanding how trees grow, people understanding this whole business about economies and habitats, and also about well-being. A lot of the people who volunteer with us are people who really need to get out and be in the landscape and be in a non-pressurized environment where they feel they can invest in that land in the future, invest their hard labor, have respite from the troubles of the world, and find, you know, either just well-being or therapy. So everything that underpins what we're trying to do is really about building social ecologies through, first of all, planting trees. But it's as much about people planting trees as it is about trees being planted by people. Jonathan, I think it's over to you.
Yes, we have one more poll for you, and I'm just going to launch that one now. You should see that in your chat. So the question is, which are the most important benefits of woodlands? So you're allowed up to 3 votes for this. So please cast your votes now.
So is this people's own personal preference, or what they think sort of globally is most important?
I would say what they think is most important to sort of humans and woodlands coexisting. Let's wait for a few responses. Thank you for your responses so far. Right, so far we have, let me see, out front we have Future Woods and Ecologies, then we have To Grow Your Own Firewood, Materials, Charcoal, etc. Well Managed and Planted Trees in third, Equal with Education, and then we've got Family Activity and Fitness actually coming up last, Nature-Based Therapy. So all of those are very pertinent sort of benefits, aren't they, Max?
Yeah, and of course, in a sense, the answer to the question is that they're all really important, and good woodlands should be able to provide all those things, so that people feel productive, knowing that the land is productive, and obviously ecologically rich as well, and obviously a lot of people say, oh well, it takes so long for a woodland to establish from planted trees, it's not worth bothering. You should just let land go wild and let it go, and then, you know, sit back and wait. But I know from my experience at Thistlewood, which is the top picture there, which was only planted 8 years ago, we have 3 pairs of breeding owls. We have foxes, kestrels, we've got butterflies. We're establishing a beehive. So I think a wood can be ecologically productive much quicker than people think, even though it's not you know, not a mature ecology at all, and it's a productive place for people. People like being there, and particularly children, for whom a woodland canopy in a mature woodland is a long way above their heads, whereas they can actually see the hazelnuts growing on my hazel trees. They can reach out and pick one off and eat it, or plant it in their own land. So I think there's a lot to be said for young woodlands, and I would defend them against the gainsayers who say it's just not worth planting trees. They can't stand the plastic tubes, which I understand, but you know, at some point we will get biodegradable, recyclable tubes, and in the meantime, if they're taken off the trees as soon as they can be and given to somebody else to plant trees in, then they have a double life. So there's bad planting of trees and bad tree management, but there's also good planting trees. Needless to say, at Woods for the Trees, we like to plant our trees so that they're happy.
So did you just want to talk about your Southfield plantation before we just...
Yes, why not? Can you still see my other screen? Can you see? Yeah. Yeah, this is the plan I've just submitted for the new English Woodland Creation Offer, which has replaced the old Woodland grant, and is, I have to say, much more. Yeah, Mark, owls, raptors, and foxes want the voles. That's right. Huge rodent population now, so, and everything's feeding on them. Yeah, so this is the way you now submit part of your evidence for the new Woodland Creation Offer, UCO as it's called. English Woodland Creation Officer, much more generous than the old Woodland Grant Scheme, maybe twice as generous. So you now get paid for protecting water. So I've got a little burn running on the edge of my wood, and that counts as a riparian buffer zone, and that's points mean prizes. And hopefully I'll get a grant for public access, which is effectively free money because I was going to give public access to the wood anyway, and that can be invested in educational work here. Those green spaces, those green blobs are open spaces where there won't be trees. The blue bits are open water or bog. I'm building a barn at the moment where we can have volunteers shelter from the blast. It's about 750 feet. And then very generously wide rides, minimum 6 to 8 meters wide. But rides are more important than trees in a woodland because they have this really rich edge ecology. And you can't have too many rides in the wood. Apart from anything else, you've got to be able to get to places, unlike that crazy planting scheme we saw earlier. Lots of different density clumps. And as you can see, well, you can't see because you probably won't know what all these acronyms are. They like their acronyms to the Forestry Commission. So SBI is silver birch. BPO is black poplar. Don't see many of those. SP is Scots pine. RO is rowan. CAR is in fact alder. PBI is downy birch. GWL is goat willow. I struggle to remember all these. Anyway, hopefully that will be a really rich environment, and hopefully we will get the grant. And if we do, there are 8,500 trees to plant. So if anybody's free that day, we will. As soon as we know we've got the grant, we'll let people know. So we would hope to plant at least half those this winter. And the great thing about this is that, you know, when people see this bare plot of land, we can take them over to Thistlewood and say, here's one we made earlier. And people can see how these things turn out, because it's quite difficult to plan a new woodland on a piece of paper, because quite often it's a bit like planning a house that you want to build. The reality turns out to be rather different. But woodlands adapt. They're very patient creatures, trees. Anyway, that's enough. So Jonathan.
Okay. Thank you, Max. So we're running short of time, so we've got 2 minutes left. If you would like to stay on, you're very welcome to.
Shall I stop sharing, Jonathan?
Yeah, I will. I should just be able to take over from you, Max. So what we want to do now is just tell you a bit about ourselves. So some of you may not know us from our website. Here it is. I hope you can see that. So Woods for the Trees. So I just wanted to sort of give you a very, very quick guided tour. So we have a blog, which we add to every once in a while. We also have guest bloggers. So if you're involved in any sort of woodland creation yourself and you'd like to write a blog and want somewhere to host that blog, then please come to us. We have a shop. And this is how we plan to fund all our activities, actually, just from making a small profit from selling clothing. So in the clothing, we have hoodies, which are ideal for planting season, which is sort of late autumn. And we also have all of Max's books. So if I just take a step back to that. So Max has written 3 books about trees. I believe there's a 4th one on the way, Max. And all of those you can buy for recommended retail price directly from us. And the good news is that the half of the price. So the last thing to tell you about, well, first of all, the webinars, for those of you who want to leave early or want to catch up with what we discussed tonight, we've got the webinar page of the webinar we've had tonight. We put some useful links at the bottom of that, and we also put to the video recording YouTube. And finally, Stuart would just like to say something about our new schools project.
Yes, this is my passion. I want to get kids engaged with the environment and planting trees. We don't grow enough trees in this country from scratch anyway. So the idea is that school children will grow trees in their school, and this page will provide them with all the information that they will need and their teachers will need. And I'm testing it out at my own school where I work, and I'm learning a lot as I go, actually. And I've learned one thing: make sure the bursar is on your side. They actually control the money. So, but yes, as we go along, I'll provide more information, but this page should provide what you need to start. Okay.
Thank you, Stuart. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Thank you, everyone, for attending. If you'd like to ask questions, please do so either in the chat or
yeah, we will happily circulate the slideshow, won't we, Jonathan? Which you're recording?
Yes, of course. Yes. Any questions for Max? Max is the expert on trees, so I don't expect I'd be able to answer anything.
Yeah, Mark's got a question.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, Max, because you've said that ancient woodlands that go into decline, and I've done a lot on soil food web and stuff, and I'm wondering whether it's because we measure things differently to the way the woodlands measure them. Because is it logical that an ancient woodland that becomes high quality, very diverse, is actually going into decline, or is it that we have different things that we're counting and looking for, and therefore making that decision?
I'm sure you're right. I mean, decline is a subjective evaluation. In terms of biodiversity, numbers of species, they would tend to go into decline. But of course, from the point of view of a mature oak tree, it's very happy to be the top dog in the wood, or rather, you know, and we know oak trees support, you know, large numbers of insects, 300 plus. In terms of, I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that if we could leave an area the size of, well, traditionally it's always Wales, isn't it? Poor Wales. If we could leave a country the size of Wales to just get on with it, and not control or favour one predator over another, because of course all our biodiversity is controlled by us. So, you know, I've talked to people recently who are very, very concerned that the damage that reintroduced beavers are having. Well, on a small scale, beavers can do absolutely shocking harm, as indeed, you know, I've got a roe deer problem. If you can just leave all that stuff to get on with it, what happens is, you know, the European lynx arrives and takes out some of the deer, and the wolf arrives and takes out some. So, in other words, there just isn't room to let woodlands totally get on with it without knowing that actually we are inadvertently fixing the ecology by not having the natural range of species. I mean, if we want bears and saber-toothed tigers back, you know, we're a bit short of room. So everything we do is an artificial ecology, and I think if you add the ecological, if you like, decline in species richness to the fact that we import crazy amounts of timber with all the impacts that importation and, you know, has, then there is a case for more of our old woodlands to be brought back into management.
Yeah.
But, you know, there are several sides to that argument, and some people do argue that that's actually not the right thing to do. But we could certainly plant woods with a more, if you like, constructed idea of what we want biodiversity to be like, rather than just the current model is that you plant trees with a grant, and after 10 years the grant runs out, and then the trees just grow for the rest of eternity. So there's nothing built in to help support the transition to a productive woodland that's churning out charcoal, hazel hurdles, timber. So, for example, if you work in the Blythe Tall Ships group, they're desperate for oak for bits of boat. They can't find it because nobody has that stuff. But we could grow it. It grows
We
on
have
trees.
some. If they want it, we have some.
Oh, well, there you go. See, well, again, it's, you know, that's part of the social ecology, isn't it? That if you can network, I mean, Susan knows about this because of the land of oak and iron where we are, but if you can link up all the ecologies with the economies, then I think you've got a much better chance of sustaining woodlands because they're productive socially and economically, and obviously biologically as well. But essentially what we're saying is that a productive woodland is productive socially, ecologically, and materially, or at least can be.
Yeah,
that's the traditional way of managing woods, to do that.
No, that's great. Thanks.
Any more questions?
Do you have a database of volunteers from Michael? Yes, we do. At the moment, we have a sort of rather lopsided distribution of volunteers. There's quite a lot in County Durham, one or two in Brighton, and one or two elsewhere. So we would love to get some volunteers in Berkshire. So I see you work for the NHS Foundation Trust. Of course, there is an NHS forest which encourages planting near hospitals for well-being and mindfulness. And we're working on a little thing, possibly with the RVI, Royal Victorian Infirmary in Newcastle, which we will sort of bring news of as it develops. But I suppose one of the things to say is, we'd love to have you sign up to our database of volunteers, and you'll get the free T-shirt. Well, I tried to do this earlier; it just doesn't work really. But anyway, the T-shirt. I suppose one thing is to sort of try and set up something near you. Your wildlife trusts, the woodland trust, will have local people on the ground, and they may have, and the tree council will, so they may have volunteering opportunities. Otherwise, find a piece of land and set one up. And Mark says, can we talk about Northeast Community Forest for your volunteers? Yeah, we can. Whether that's one for a separate thing. Yeah, let's set something else up about that, because I think I'll perhaps email you on that subject. Yeah, I mean, I think community forests are an absolutely brilliant thing. There are some quite successful models now that you can download information about. This is where basically people either get together to buy a piece of land, or they get council to give them a piece of land, or they basically scrounge it from somewhere, and form a plan to share the labor and share the produce and share the pleasure. And I think that's absolutely an important way forward, because it means people are investing long term as stakeholders in their own environment, social and do the books contain info on preparing land, etc.? Real beginner questions. Yes, I mean, the little book of planting trees is a sort of basic primer for that. In terms of preparing land, it depends rather on the land, Elizabeth. Depends, what's on there at the moment, whether it's grass or a crop. But there are certainly lots of good approaches, and by all means, drop us a line and we'll answer specific questions, because I think you are wanting to plant trees, aren't you, Elizabeth? And we perhaps need a sort of an online Zoom, God help us.
Yeah,
okay.
I'll email you, because it's a paddock that's not had much done to it at the moment. It's quite damp, and there's woodland next to it, a bit of a spinney that the guy just does nothing with. Right. And the farmer just lets all his water come into the paddock. He's kind of built his land up, so mine floods a bit.
Which as I found out recently, he's allowed to do under a law of Henry VIII that has never been repealed, that allows you to shed water onto any neighbouring piece of land with no comeback.
No.
Incredible that that's still on the statute books, but it is. You should be being paid to keep water on you. Anyway, Elizabeth, let's talk about that. Perhaps we can fix something up, because obviously, once we have an idea of exactly what your land consists of and its topography and things, then we could probably give a bit more targeted advice.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Good.
Okay.
And I suppose one question to fire back at the participants is if any of you have links with local schools that you think might be interested in our Nuts for the Trees project, do get in touch, because we think it's potentially a really rich way of getting children involved in growing the easier trees from seed. Essentially, the bigger the nut, the easier it is to grow.
And now is the time to start, right, Max?
Yeah, September, October are the perfect times to be collecting hazels and Scots pines, and well, that's perhaps not Scots pines, but anyway, there's information on the website and even more in the little book. And the if I can find it, the Tree Council produces a book called The Good Seed Guide, and it's brilliant. It's really, really good, very straightforward. Nice and simple stuff, and I use it, so because I sometimes forget how to make things happen. It'll be somewhere here.
Yes, thank you for that, Mark. We will talk to Children's Forest. That's a good idea. We're starting to find a few organisations like that. They're all very sort of hyper local, but at least most of them are.
Yeah, and the other thing we're increasingly working with is forest schools, which are now hugely popular. And of course, mostly they work in mature woodlands, but actually I think there's something to be said for having forest schools in young woods, because you can really get intimate with the biology of a young tree.
There's a question about, is it primary or secondary? Well, I'm doing primary because that's where I work, but I'd be very keen for secondary schools to be involved as well. I don't see why not.
Yeah. Oh, so Susan's going to do the forest school training. Oh, nice one. Great. That'll be brilliant fun. Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping to get a couple of forest schools working in Thistlewood soon. So what else we got? Other questions? I mean, obviously, some of the sort of follow-ups to this webinar will be dealt with in a subsequent webinar, when we'll sort of try and get more sort of specialised and hopefully more kind of discursive chats going rather than this. Oh, Elizabeth has a brother who's a secondary school head in Cumbria. Right.
Excellent.
Yeah, good.
Please do spread the word.
I think at some point we'll probably have a Nuts for the Trees t-shirt, won't we, Jonathan?
Yes, why not? Or
some sort of, and maybe some Nuts for the Trees tote bags or something.
Yeah.
And I mean, if a school does want to sign up to Nuts for the Trees, you know, we will happily, I think, send them a free copy of Little Book of Planting Trees just to get them interested. Obviously, if schools would like to contribute by donating or just doing it, that would be great.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone, for attending. I hope you've enjoyed it and found it worthwhile. And
yeah, and please keep in touch through the blog, and you know, you can email us and we'll answer any questions you come up with as we go on, and hopefully some good news soon about new woodlands being established and volunteering opportunities up here. But it would be great if some other people in different parts of the country could be setting things up, finding bits of land. There's quite a lot on our website about, you know, finding bits of land and things, and we can provide quite a lot of support if people do want to know how to find a piece of land and what to do once they've found one. So, you know, by all means, do get in touch.
okay. So thank you, everyone. There'll be a recording of this on our webinar page, and I'll send that via an email to all of you as well, probably tomorrow.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, everyone. Lovely to see you all. I'll see some of you soon in one guise or another. And look forward to a good planting and seed collecting season.
Cheers then. Bye.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. I don't know.